can change a person's entire life. Sometimes, in order to protect ourselves, we make choices that cannot be undone. But are those choices worth it when the price to pay is a life and the destruction of an entire family? Lily once believed she could hide her secret forever. But when Jacob, her husband's son from a previous marriage, discovered the truth, the game of power and manipulation began. Jacob's threats and increasingly bold demands pushed Lily to the edge of her endurance. One wrong decision made in a moment of rage changed everything. Follow the dramatic story of betrayal, blackmail, and the unimaginable consequences of one fateful night. Lily had always maintained the image of the perfect wife. To the outside world, she was loving, loyal, and devoted to her husband, Michael, a man who adored her deeply. But beneath this polished facade, she was hiding a dangerous secret. For months now, Lily had been involved in a torrid affair with James, a man who had awakened something inside her she couldn't resist. Despite knowing the risks, despite the potential for her entire life to collapse, she continued seeing him, drawn to the thrill like a moth to a flame. Her perfect world started to crumble the day Jacob, Michael's son from a previous marriage, stumbled upon her secret. Jacob had never liked Lily. To him, she was an intruder in his father's life, someone who had disrupted the family's balance. When he accidentally discovered incriminating text messages between her and James on her phone, his dislike turned to anger and disgust. Rather than exposing Lily immediately, Jacob saw an opportunity. This wasn't just leverage, it was power. Power over the woman he resented. Instead of confronting his father with the evidence, Jacob decided to manipulate Lily, trapping her in a web of fear and control. He knew that with one slip, he could tear apart her marriage, her reputation, and everything she had worked so hard to build. The knowledge of her affair was now his weapon, and he wielded it mercilessly. The tension between them reached a boiling point when Jacob confronted Lily one evening. She had just returned from meeting James when Jacob approached her, his face cold, eyes sharp with malice. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know everything," he said simply, holding up his phone with the screenshots of her messages glaring back at her. "And if you don't do exactly what I say, Dad will know too." Lily's heart raced. In that moment, she felt the walls closing in on her. The guilt of her affair had been eating away at her for months, but now, it was more than just guilt, now it was fear. The kind of fear that paralyzes you, the kind that makes your breath catch in your throat and your mind race to find a way out. She stared at Jacob, unable to find the words to defend herself, her mind spinning with panic. "Jacob, please," she started, her voice trembling, but he cut her off with a cold smile. "No, Lily. You don't get to beg," he said, stepping closer. "You do what I say, or I'll destroy you. I'll destroy this whole family." Terror gripped her. She knew what Jacob was capable of. The bitterness he held toward her had festered for years, and now he had the means to take everything from her. Lily's mind raced with the potential consequences. If Michael found out about her affair, it wouldn't just end their marriage, it would ruin her reputation, her status, everything she had built in this town. She couldn't let that happen. Feeling trapped, Lily had no choice but to agree to Jacob's demands. At first, his requests were small, just a bit of money here and there, making excuses for him when he was out late. But each demand chipped away at her, and the more power Jacob tasted, the more he wanted. In the quiet hours of the night, when Michael slept soundly beside her, Lily would lie awake, her mind racing with fear. How had she let it get to this point? How had a moment of weakness spiraled into a nightmare that seemed inescapable? The more she tried to keep her world from collapsing, the more fragile it became. But the worst was yet to come. Lily didn't realize that this was only the beginning, that Jacob's manipulation was about to take a darker, more dangerous turn. And as the pressure mounted, she found herself teetering on the edge of a precipice from which there might be no return. From the moment Lily gave in to Jacob's initial demands, she knew her nightmare was far from over. The first request had been simple money for a new pair of shoes, then covering for him when he skipped school. But even these small acts of submission began to weigh heavily on her conscience. She could feel the shackles tightening around her, trapping her in a situation that seemed impossible to escape. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe if I just do what he wants, this will all go away, she thought. But Jacob wasn't the type to let things go. He had tasted control, and with each passing day, his demands grew bolder. What started as minor favors quickly spiraled into something much more sinister. "Tell Dad I was with you all night," Jacob demanded one evening, eyes narrowing as he leaned casually against her bedroom door. The faint smell of alcohol clung to him, and Lily's stomach turned. "You want me to lie to him again," she whispered, her voice shaky as she stood by the bed, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. Jacob's smirk only deepened. "It's not like you haven't lied before," he sneered, throwing her affair with James back in her face without hesitation. "You're good at it?" Lily swallowed hard, the weight of her own secrets pressing down on her chest. The more she tried to resist Jacob's manipulation, the more he tightened his grip on her life. What Jacob wanted wasn't just money or lies, it was power. And each time she submitted to one of his demands, she felt herself slipping further and further into a darkness she couldn't control. The worst part was that Jacob enjoyed it. He reveled in the knowledge that he had his stepmother wrapped around his finger. He could see the fear in her eyes, the guilt that gnawed away at her every time she agreed to cover for him. And he thrived on it. Soon, his demands weren't just about money or excuses. They became more dangerous, more twisted. He pushed her to cover for his nights of drinking and reckless behavior, even going so far as to ask her to forge Michael's signature on important documents. Each time, Lily's hands would tremble as she completed these tasks, her mind racing with the fear of what might happen if she refused. But she couldn't refuse. Not with the ever-present threat of exposure hanging over her head. She imagined the look on Michael's face if he ever discovered the truth. The love and trust in his eyes would vanish, replaced by betrayal and disgust. The thought alone was enough to keep her locked in Jacob's grip. The guilt of the affair with James was now the least of her worries. What haunted her day and night was the fear of being utterly controlled by a teenager who showed no mercy. She was no longer the strong, confident woman she once prided herself on being. Now, she was a shadow of her former self, anxious, jittery, and constantly on edge. It didn't take long for Michael to notice. He had always trusted Lily implicitly, but recently, something had changed. She was distant, distracted, always finding excuses to avoid spending time with him. Whenever he asked about Jacob, she would give vague answers, avoiding eye contact. And though he couldn't put his finger on it, he knew something was wrong. His once happy marriage was beginning to feel strained, as if something sinister was lurking just beneath the surface. One evening, Michael confronted her. "Lily, what's going on? You've been so distant lately. Is something wrong?" His voice was filled with concern, but Lily could hear the underlying suspicion in his tone. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could she possibly explain the truth? That she was being blackmailed by his own son? That she had been unfaithful? The weight of the lies threatened to suffocate her. Instead, she shook her head, offering him a weak smile. "It's nothing, Michael. I've just been stressed. Work has been overwhelming, that's all," she lied, forcing her voice to remain steady. But Michael wasn't convinced. The tension between them grew heavier, and Lily knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Meanwhile, Jacob's control over her became even more insidious. He began demanding more outrageous things, pushing her to break the law, cover for his criminal activities, even suggesting that she steal from her own husband to fund his reckless lifestyle. And the worst part was, Lily was beginning to feel trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. One night, when Jacob didn't return home until the early hours of the morning, he barged into her room, demanding more money. Lily, her nerves frayed, refused for the first time. "No," she said, standing her ground. "I can't keep doing this, Jacob. This has to stop." But Jacob's eyes darkened, and his smile turned cruel. "You don't get to decide that," he hissed, stepping closer. "Remember, Lily. I hold your life in my hands. One word to Dad, and everything you've built will come crashing down." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She knew he was right. As much as she wanted to fight back, as much as she wanted to regain control of her own life, she was powerless. Jacob's grip on her had tightened beyond anything she could break free from. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the horrifying truth: there was no way out. Not unless she was willing to destroy everything she had. And even then, the cost might be too great to bear. Lily's life was unraveling, thread by thread, and the breaking point was inevitable. Every morning, she woke up dreading what new demand Jacob would throw at her. Her nerves were constantly on edge, her mind consumed by fear and regret. Each step she took felt heavier, as if the weight of the lies she carried were physically bearing down on her shoulders. She no longer felt like a person in control of her own life, but rather a puppet in Jacob's twisted game. Jacob, once just a resentful teenager, had morphed into something more dangerous. His demands weren't just about money anymore. He thrived on pushing Lily to her limits, testing how far she would go to keep her secret safe. Each new demand was a test of her loyalty, a cruel game where he held all the cards. One evening, Jacob stumbled home, clearly drunk. His clothes were disheveled, and the scent of alcohol and cigarette smoke clung to him. Lily had been waiting anxiously for hours, her heart pounding with dread. She hated this new version of Jacob, the reckless, heartless young man who had once been just a troubled boy. But she hated herself more for what she had become: weak, terrified, and utterly at his mercy. "You're late," she said quietly, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. Her nerves were already frayed, and she felt on the verge of breaking. Jacob shrugged, swaying slightly as he leaned against the wall. "So what? Not like you're gonna tell Dad, right?" His voice was slurred, his words sharp with mockery. Lily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had spent months trapped in this nightmare, constantly on edge, constantly worrying about what Jacob might do next. And now, she couldn't take it anymore. "You can't keep doing this, Jacob," she said, her voice more forceful than she had expected. "I can't keep covering for you." Jacob's eyes flickered with a mix of amusement and something darker. He took a step closer to her, his smile turning cruel. "Oh, but you will. Because if you don't, I'll tell Dad everything." Lily's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with fear. The threat, always lurking in the background, now felt like a blade pressed against her skin. She wanted to scream, to tell Jacob to go to hell, but she couldn't. The consequences of him revealing the truth were too horrifying to imagine. The loss of Michael's trust, the collapse of her marriage, the public humiliation — it was all too much to bear. But something inside her was shifting. She was reaching her limit, teetering on the edge of sanity. Every moment spent in fear of Jacob's threats was pushing her closer to a decision she wasn't sure she could make. She couldn't go on like this, not anymore. "Jacob, please," she begged, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'll do anything. Just stop, please stop." Jacob laughed, the sound harsh and cold. "You're pathetic," he sneered, shaking his head. "I used to think you were this perfect, put-together woman, but now I see what you really are. Weak. Desperate." The words cut deeper than Lily expected. She had always prided herself on being in control, on managing her life with precision and grace. But now, she was nothing more than a shell of the woman she once was, completely broken down by the guilt of her affair and Jacob's relentless manipulation. "I'm done," Jacob said suddenly, his tone shifting to something colder, more detached. "I'm bored with this. You're not even fun to mess with anymore." Lily froze, unsure of what he meant. What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jacob smirked, taking a step closer until he was right in front of her. "I'm saying I want more. I'm saying you better do exactly what I say, or I'm not just telling Dad about James, I'm going to make sure your life is destroyed. You won't just lose Dad. You'll lose everything." The air seemed to leave the room. Lily felt the walls closing in on her, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This was at the moment she had feared. Jacob wasn't just threatening to expose her affair anymore. He was threatening to annihilate her entire life. And she didn't know how to stop him. The pressure built inside her, the weight of months of fear, guilt, and anxiety finally boiling over. She felt herself slipping, losing control of the tight grip she had kept on her emotions for so long. Her hands shook as she wiped away the tears that had started to fall. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't ruin me." Jacob's eyes gleamed with triumph, sensing her complete and utter defeat. "Good," he said softly. "Then you'll do what I say. No more questions. No more complaints. From now on, you're going to do exactly what I want. Or I'll destroy you." Lily's heart raced, the gravity of his words sinking in. She had lost. There was no way out of this. Jacob had won, and now she was at his mercy, completely and utterly trapped in his twisted game. That night, as she lay in bed next to Michael, the weight of everything pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. She could hear his steady breathing, the sound that used to comfort her, now only reminded her of how far she had fallen. Her mind raced, trying to find a solution, trying to think of a way to regain control of her life. But no matter how many times she turned it over in her head, the truth was always the same. She was trapped. The days that followed were a blur of tension and anxiety. Every time Jacob spoke to her, it was with a smug grin, knowing he had complete control over her. And every time she saw Michael, her guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the lie she was living. She had never felt so helpless, so powerless. But somewhere deep inside her, a small spark of defiance was beginning to flicker. Lily wasn't sure when it had started, but as the days passed, that spark grew brighter. She couldn't live like this forever. Jacob had pushed her too far, and though she didn't know how or when, she knew one thing for certain. Lily sat alone in the dimly lit room, her thoughts spiraling out of control. The weight of Jacob's manipulation, his relentless demands, and the constant threat of exposure had become too much to bear. Tonight, something inside her shifted. The fear that had consumed her for so long was now being replaced by something darker: anger. She wasn't going to let him ruin her life any longer. The moment Jacob stumbled through the door, reeking of alcohol, Lily knew this was the night things would change. He looked at her with the same smug expression, knowing he had her cornered. "What now, Lily?" Jacob sneered, leaning against the wall. "You gonna cry again? Or maybe beg?" Lily's heart raced, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was rage. She stood up, her eyes locking onto his with a coldness that Jacob hadn't seen before. "This ends tonight, Jacob," she said, her voice steady but laced with resolve. "I'm done being your puppet." Jacob laughed, stepping closer. "You think you can stop me? I hold your life in my hands. One word to Dad, and you lose everything." Lily's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the adrenaline coursing through her. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she replied, her voice steady. Jacob's face twisted into a sneer, his arrogance growing with each passing second. "You're bluffing. You don't have the guts." In an instant, Lily moved toward him, her gaze never leaving his. Her mind was clouded with months of fear and manipulation, and in that moment, she didn't see any other way out. Before Jacob could react, her eyes flickered to the heavy porcelain vase on the table next to her. Without thinking, she grabbed it. Jacob's sneer faded as he saw the shift in her eyes, but it was too late. With a surge of desperation, Lily swung the vase with all her strength. The porcelain made contact with Jacob's head in a sickening thud. His eyes widened in shock as he staggered back, his hand instinctively reaching for the side of his head where blood was now starting to trickle down. "Lily, what the hell?" Jacob slurred, stumbling back a few steps. For a moment, Lily stood frozen, the shattered vase pieces at her feet. The silence in the room was deafening. She watched in horror as Jacob swayed on his feet, disoriented and struggling to stay upright. Then, with a final, labored breath, his legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. Panic gripped Lily as she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching frantically for a pulse. Her breath caught in her throat when she realized it was gone. Jacob wasn't breathing. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced. "What have I done?" she thought, staring down at Jacob's lifeless body sprawled on the floor, blood pooling around his head. The reality of what had just happened hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just a fight. This was murder. Lily's body trembled as she backed away from Jacob's body, the enormity of her actions crashing over her. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She just wanted to stop him, to make him understand that he couldn't control her anymore. But now Jacob was dead, and there was no undoing what she had done. Her mind scrambled for a solution, some way to make this right, but she knew there was no going back. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The only thing left to do was to figure out how to survive it. Lily sat frozen in the dark, her hands trembling, still covered in Jacob's blood. Everything had changed in a matter of minutes. She had killed him. An impulsive decision made out of anger and desperation had led to this horrific outcome. Her heart pounded wildly, and her mind was in a frenzy. She tried to calm herself, but the echo of Jacob's death was a constant, unrelenting presence in her mind. But there wasn't time to think. Michael would be home soon, and she needed to cover up what had happened before he found out. Moving quickly, she pulled Jacob's lifeless body onto the bed, then frantically wiped the blood from the floor. Her heart raced with every sound outside the door. When everything was as clean as she could manage, Lily sat down, taking deep, shaky breaths, trying to calm herself before facing Michael. When Michael returned home, as usual, he walked straight into the living room. Lily waited for him, trying to appear calm, but inside, she was spiraling into chaos. "I haven't seen Jacob," Michael said, glancing around the room, not noticing the fear barely masked behind Lily's calm exterior. "He went out," Lily replied, her voice so steady that it didn't raise any suspicion from Michael. However, it wasn't long before Michael sensed something was wrong. He began to notice strange changes in Lily's behavior. She avoided mentioning Jacob, grew more withdrawn, and seemed increasingly nervous. Doubts began to swirl in Michael's mind, but he couldn't quite put the pieces together yet. Finally, one morning, when Lily was out of the house, Michael decided to go into Jacob's room. He hadn't seen his son in days, and something inside him told him that something was terribly wrong. When he opened the door, a foul odor hit him immediately. Michael stepped inside, and what he saw made his heart stop. Jacob lay motionless on the bed, his skin pale and his body stiff. Michael rushed to him, but it was already too late. In that instant, his world collapsed. His son was dead. and the only person who could have been involved was Lily. Staggering downstairs, Michael's heart filled with a mixture of grief and fury. Lily returned home shortly after, and as soon as she walked through the door, she was met with Michael's icy, rage-filled gaze. She didn't need him to say anything. She knew. Lily tried to speak, to explain, but Michael wouldn't let her. "You killed my son," he snarled, his voice filled with a venomous hatred that shook her to her core. Lily broke down, unable to deny the truth. She had gone too far, and now there was no turning back. The trust, the love, and the regret all disintegrated in that moment. Michael looked at Lily one last time, unable to comprehend how the woman he had loved for so long could have caused such a horrifying tragedy. He walked out of the house, leaving Lily alone with her grief and guilt. Lily sat in the living room, staring blankly at the front door. Everything was over. Michael had left, and she knew that the truth about Jacob's death would come out eventually. She had been carrying the weight of this horrible secret, but now, there was no more hiding. The death of Jacob was not something that could be buried forever. The truth would emerge, and when it did, she would have to face the consequences. An hour after Michael left, there was a knock on the door. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up. 2 uniformed police officers stood outside, their faces stern. Michael had called them, and he had reported Jacob's suspicious absence. It wasn't just suspicion, though Michael knew that something terrible had happened in the house. As Lily opened the door, her eyes locked with the officers, and she knew this was the moment she had dreaded. There was no escape from this. "We're here to investigate Jacob's disappearance," one of the officers said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Lily had been waiting for this moment, but she hadn't expected it to come so quickly. "Jacob," Lily's voice caught in her throat, unable to form the words. Panic flooded her, but deep down, she knew this was inevitable. She had made too many mistakes, and now, it was time to pay for them. The officers asked her to step aside as they entered the house. Slowly, numbly, Lily complied, stepping back as they made their way upstairs to Jacob's room. It didn't take long before they found his lifeless body, the grim evidence of what had occurred. The police immediately secured the scene, sealing off the house as an investigation began. Lily was escorted out of the house, her hands cuffed, while curious neighbors gathered to watch. She didn't resist. She knew that there was no point. As she was led to the police car, tears welled up in her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that everything had spiraled out of control. There was no going back. At the police station, Lily sat across from the investigator. His eyes bore into hers as he asked her to explain what had happened. Slowly, haltingly, Lily confessed everything: the affair, the blackmail, Jacob's manipulation, and the moment of blind rage that led to his death. She held nothing back, no longer able to hide from the truth. The investigators listened without expression, noting every detail as Lily's story unfolded, a tragic family unraveling. But no matter how tragic, the law had to be upheld. The following day, Lily was formally charged with manslaughter. The investigation revealed that Jacob's death had resulted from the blunt force trauma caused by the vase. The evidence from the crime scene, combined with Lily's confession, painted a clear picture. She was taken into custody and awaited trial. Michael, the man who had once loved her, was now the key witness against her. He couldn't forgive what had happened, but at the same time, he couldn't help but pity the broken woman who had been pushed to the brink of desperation. Throughout the investigation, Michael never saw Lily again, and he had no intention of forgiving her. When the trial date finally arrived, Lily sat in the courtroom, her face gaunt and haggard after months of incarceration. The court listened to the entire story, and although the truth was revealed, nothing could excuse what she had done. Lily knew she would have to pay the price, not just for Jacob's death but for every wrong decision that had led her to this point. In the end, Lily was sentenced to several years in prison for manslaughter and obstruction of justice. She bowed her head, accepting her fate. The only freedom she found now was in facing the truth, no longer having to live in fear and lies. But the cost of that freedom was her life behind bars. The law had brought closure to one tragic chapter in Lily's life, but in her mind, the memories of Jacob and the life she had destroyed would never fade. It was all over, but the pain would endure forever. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If you were captivated by this true crime story and want to see more thrilling cases, please hit the like button to support us. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who also loves real-life crime stories and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the case. Be sure to subscribe to the Dark Crime Mysteries channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on the latest gripping cases that you won't want to miss. Thank you for your support.